Question number 9, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Defence. How many New Zealand Defence Force personnel have begun training and preparation for deployment to Iraq, and when was he first advised that that training had begun?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, there has been no decision to deploy troops to Iraq. I have not been advised that New Zealand Defence Force personnel are training to deploy to Iraq.
Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question. Honourable Phil Goff.
How does he match the answer that he has just given to the House with a statement from a spokesperson for the Minister of Defence on Tuesday? And I want to read it, sir, because it's in quote marks, that Jerry Brownlee had, the first part isn't, the second is, that had confirmed that Defence Force personnel had begun training, and the spokesman said, quote, some training and preparation on a contingency basis had begun. That was his spokesperson on Tuesday.
Order, the question's been asked. Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
That's right, Mr Speaker, and that training is about language and culture and various other things. And as I explained yesterday, we have 100 personnel in the Middle East. We have not made a decision to deploy to Iraq, and we are not training people to deploy to Iraq.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable
Mr Speaker, if he keeps saying no decision has been taken, why did John Key tell Tony Abbott when he was in Australia that 40 to 100 New Zealand Defence Force personnel would be deployed to Iraq?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, now we're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. I was with the Prime Minister in Australia, and what I can tell the member over there is that a discussion was had on the basis that if New Zealand was to contribute to the fight against ISIS, then it would be on humanitarian grounds, intelligence capacity and capacity building for Iraqi forces. And if requested by the Iraqi government, then we may partner with the Australians with numbers at around those limits. Not weasel words, Speaker. Very direct.
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
What did he, as Minister of Defence, tell the American Secretary of Defence on his recent visit to the United States about what the likely military contribution of New Zealand to Iraq would be? And
Order, Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Yes, okay. And we know that when Phil gets records, he often alters them to his own story. A long record of that. Mr Speaker, we discussed a number of things, not the least of which was the current circumstances surrounding the Secretary's own position, and I made it very clear to him that we appreciated the friendship that he has extended to New Zealand over a period of years.
Order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable
Mr Speaker, I asked a very specific question. What did he tell the Secretary of Defence about what the likely contribution of New Zealand to Iraq would be? The Minister didn't even address that.
I'll hear from the Honourable Jerry Brownlee before I will.
Mr Speaker, what I did say to him was that we had people in the Middle East at the present time looking at the prospects around capacity building. I explained to him that we would be most likely to join with the Australians if a decision was made, but made it very clear to him that no decision was made at this point.
Supplementary question. Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, why would he deploy Kiwi soldiers to Iraq and put their lives at risk when that can do nothing to resolve the fundamental problems underlying the ineffectiveness and incompetence of the Iraqi army, which has been disclosed as a level of entrenched incompetence to the extent that military leaders are politically appointed, military officers by their commission, 50,000 are ghost soldiers, and money is diverted into the pockets of officials?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, Mr Speaker, I point out to the member once again that we have not made a decision to deploy. I'm most interested that the member has that information. They are the sort of things that concern me also.
Question number 10, David Bennett.
Mr Speaker, my question is